is going to be the last part of it. Transitions, also called connectives. Some people call them bridges. Have you started the video back? Okay, thank you. Yeah, there it is, bridges. Whatever you use to bring the audience with you from thing to thing, part to part, point to point in your speech, that's going to be a transition. And you're going to need them after the introduction, before the first main point, between every main point on the outline, and after the last main point and before the conclusion. You need to put them on the outline. I showed you, well, here's Madison's example. He has his transitions on the outline. He puts exactly what he plans to say to bring us from this part to this part and from this part to this part. There's a transition between every major part of the speech that pulls the audience along, that bridges the gap between the main points. What he mostly does, and you can do whatever works for you, but what he mostly does is just introduces the next part first. Let's look at how hypnotists choose the perfect subject, and then he gets into that. And then, okay, believe it or not, you were all just one step away from being deeply hypnotized. You simply need an induction. And so he goes into talking about inductions. Once the subject is hypnotized, we continue on to the fun stuff, suggestions. So he's going to tell us about suggestions. He mentions what happens here and introduces what's coming here. So he has a transition between every part of it. And there's even space on the worksheet for you to plan your transitions. And if you have it written on here, it needs to be typed on your final version, just like you see here, right? If it's planned on the worksheet, type it up the way it looks. Make it look like this on the on your final product, your final outline. So, get back to these transitions. They lead the listener from idea to idea. Let's begin with what this is. Now that we've seen what that is, let's look at what this next thing is. Now that we've covered those things, let's move on. In summary, we have covered some interesting facts about this, and then you're moving on to your conclusion. There's lots of different ways to make transitions. As long as you bring the audience, get their mind on the next part. Don't leave them thinking about the introduction. You've done the introduction. Let's go here. And you move them with you to the next part. That's what transitions do. They're connectors or bridges that carry the listener from part to part of the speech. Remember who it's for and give us what we need to keep up with your presentation. Transitions help with that. They help us to keep up because we know when you're moving on. You tell us in a transition that you're moving on. They don't have to be actual sentences. You don't have to be as complicated as some of the samples might be. You can simply say, to begin, or now let's look at this, or in conclusion, let's summarize. As long as it keeps the speech moving along and helps the flow keep going. Use them. Don't just plan them on the outline. Say them out loud. If it's planned on the outline, it needs to be said out loud unless it's part 1 or 5. The teacher stuff doesn't come out loud. Anything part 2, 3, and 4 is all out loud, every bit of it. Everything you plan should be out loud. So if you plan them on the outline and you have a worksheet that shows some transitions and it's typed up for the final outline, they need to be said out loud. Don't skip them. They're not for me, they're for everybody. And if we don't hear it, it doesn't count. Because the audience doesn't have your outline in front of them, just me. So be sure it counts. Say it out loud. If it's there, say it out loud. For most parts of the outline, except part 1 and part 5, which is teacher stuff, it's not enough just to have it on paper. You have to use it. The speech is what is heard out loud, not what is planned on the outline. So use all parts from part 2 to part 4 out loud in the speech itself. Okay, so if I was giving this speech, if this was mine, if this said Tracy Phillips instead of Madison Hagler, where would I start talking? What's the first thing I would say to the audience? After I come up here, I've got my things, and I'm sitting here and I'm looking at y'all. What do I say first? Look up here. First word out of my mouth. What do you think it is? Do I say introduction? Roman numeral 1, attention getter. No, those are just labels. You don't have to say those out loud. Please don't. I've had people do that, and I'm like, please don't. Please, just make it conversational. So what would I say first? Would I say, I want my audience to understand the 4 basic steps to modern hypnosis? Nope, that's in part 1. Part 1 is silent. That's just for me. That's teacher stuff. So where do I start talking? When I say hypnotist, how many of you imagine a man swinging a pocket watch saying, you're getting very sleepy? That's the first thing he says. If you watch that video, that's where he starts. That's his planned opening statement. That's what he says first. And he goes through it, and then credibility. I began studying rapid hypnosis in the 6th grade. I learned everything I possibly could from every source I could get my hands on. 2 years later, I successfully hypnotized my first subject, and since then, I've hypnotized dozens of people with a 99% success rate. What's he doing in the credibility? He's answering the question, how do you know? He's answering the question that all audiences have. How do you know about this? Why'd you choose this topic? What's it got to do with you? Well, I began studying it when I was young, and I've continued to study it, and here's what has happened since then. He connects it to himself. Adaptation. I'm not a real big fan of this adaptation. I think it could have been a little less persuasive. I feel like this one is a little too persuasive. But he says, it's time that the stereotypical watch-swinging hypnotist be left in the dust, along with the outdated technique. It's time for the general public to be more aware of the modern methods of hypnosis. If you're going to make an assertion like that, you need to follow up with why. Because we're sitting there going, well, why is it time? I mean, what's so important about that now? You know, you really need to stay away from stuff like important and need and should. Those are persuasive things. So I think his adaptation could have been different. But you got to find something to connect the topic to the audience. And I would have been more excited if he had said, what if one of these days you go to a hypnotist show? You're on a cruise, and that's part of the entertainment, and he calls on you. Well, my speech today will give you a little information that you can use if you're ever in that situation. Okay, cool. I would have liked that better. Something that's more of a connection to real life, not just, it's time that we understood, because is it really? I mean, why? The point, in the hopes of enlightening many of you today, I will walk you through and briefly explain the 4 main steps of rapid hypnosis. Right here, I want my audience to understand the 4 basic steps to modern hypnosis. He's just rephrasing that, putting it right here in the point. Okay? And then the preview, tell them what you're going to tell them. You will learn what a set piece is, how inductions induce the hypnotic trance, the power of suggestion, and even the proper way to wake up the subject. First, let's look at how hypnotists choose the perfect subject. A hypnotist will use a short test called a set piece to test the audience's suggestibility. And then he just goes through each and every part of this. All of it's used. So watch this. while reading the outline and see how it goes. It's not perfect, but it's a great example of an A level speech. He got an A for it. You know, isn't that kind of what you want? It's good grade. So yeah, see how he does it. It's really cool. Normally I show this in class, but we're not going to do that today. All right, you can turn that off.